General George S. Patton stood before his Third Army officers in a conquered German city, days after Nazi Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Victory was complete. Allied flags flew over Berlin. But Patton wasn't celebrating. He was furious. "We fought the wrong enemy," he told his shocked officers. "We should have gone after the Soviets. Hell, we should ally with the Germans and attack the Russians now while we have the chance." His staff exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't off-the-record griping. This was the commanding general of America's most successful army openly advocating for World War III, days after World War II had ended. Within weeks, Eisenhower would relieve him of command. Within months, he'd be dead in a car accident that many believed was no accident at all. This is the story of George S. Patton Jr., the general who won every battle he fought, who never lost a campaign, who terrified the Germans more than any other Allied commander, but also the general who slapped shell-shocked soldiers, who sacrificed men to rescue his son-in-law, who wanted to start another war before the last one had even ended. He was America's greatest warrior and its most controversial general. He saved thousands of lives with his tactical brilliance and ended careers with his volcanic temper. He was a genius and a madman, often in the same hour. This is the man behind the legend, the real Patton, the one they don't teach you about in history class. Part 1. The Warrior Born, 1885 to 1918. George Smith Patton Jr. was born November 11, 1885, into a family that worshipped war. His grandfather was a Confederate colonel killed at Cedar Creek. His great-uncle died at Gettysburg. His family told stories of military glory the way other families told bedtime stories. Young George absorbed every word, but he had a problem. He was dyslexic, though the term didn't exist yet. He couldn't read until age 12. His family thought he was slow. School was torture. But what George lacked in academics, he made up for in determination that bordered on obsession. He believed in reincarnation. Not casually, he genuinely believed he'd been a warrior in past lives, a Roman legionnaire, a soldier with Napoleon, a cavalryman in ancient Greece. He would later write poems about these memories, describing battles he'd fought centuries before his birth. His staff thought he was eccentric. Patton knew he was right. At 18, he enrolled at Virginia Military Institute, then transferred to West Point. He was a mediocre student, but an exceptional athlete. He competed in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the first ever modern pentathlon, finishing 5th. He was arguably the best swordsman in the US Army, so skilled that the Army adopted his sword design, the Patton saber, for cavalry use. When World War I broke out, Patton was 31 and desperate for combat. He'd spent his entire adult life preparing for war but had never heard a shot fired in anger. He volunteered for everything. When the US Army formed its first tank corps, Patton jumped at it. Tanks were new, dangerous, and likely to see heavy combat. Perfect. Baptism by fire. In September 1918, Patton led American tanks into battle for the first time at the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He didn't lead from behind. He walked ahead of his tanks, directing them through machine gun fire. A French officer watched in disbelief as Patton calmly stood in the open, bullets kicking up dirt around him, waving his tanks forward. Then he was hit. A bullet struck him in the upper leg, missing his femoral artery by less than an inch. He collapsed in a shell crater. His orderly dragged him to cover. Patton was convinced he was dying. He started dictating his will, believing these were his final moments. He survived, obviously, earned the Distinguished Service Cross, spent weeks in the hospital, but something fundamental had changed. Patton had faced death and hadn't flinched. He'd led men in combat and they'd followed. He'd found his purpose. War wasn't hell for George Patton. War was home. Part 2. The Wilderness Years, 1919 to 1942. The peacetime general. The interwar years were agony for Patton. No battles to fight, no enemies to destroy, just endless peacetime duties, training exercises, and the slow death of professional stagnation. The army was tiny, promotions rare. Patton was a major for years, then finally made lieutenant colonel. He was 49 years old. But Patton spent those years studying. He read every military history he could find. He studied Hannibal, Caesar, Napoleon, Frederick the Great. He memorized battles, analyzed tactics, absorbed lessons from conflicts spanning 3,000 years. While other officers played golf, Patton was reading about cavalry charges at Cannae. He also cultivated a persona, the profanity-laced speeches, the ivory-handled revolvers. Not pearl, he'd correct anyone who said pearl, insisting only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry pearl-handled pistols. The mirror-shined helmet, the riding crop. Every detail was calculated to create an image of a warrior from another age. His contemporaries thought he was a clown. Eisenhower thought he was brilliant but unstable. Omar Bradley thought he was a glory hound. George Marshall saw potential but worried about Patton's judgment. Everyone agreed he could fight. Nobody was sure he could be trusted with an army. When World War II broke out in 1939, Patton was 54 years old and still a colonel. Time was running out. If he didn't get a combat command soon, he'd retire having never fought a real war. The thought terrified him more than any enemy. Part 3. North Africa. The Making of a Legend. 1942 to 1943. Operation Torch. November 1942. Patton led American forces in their first major operation against the Germans, the invasion of North Africa. As a major general commanding the Western Task Force, he landed in Morocco and quickly secured the coast. His reputation for aggressive action was already forming. But the real test came in March 1943, after the disaster at Kasserine Pass. American forces had been humiliated by Rommel's Afrika Korps. Eisenhower needed someone to restore discipline and fighting spirit. He sent Patton to take command of 2nd Corps. Patton arrived like a storm. He immediately cracked down on discipline. Everyone would wear helmets, even miles behind the lines. Uniforms would be regulation. Salutes would be crisp. Officers would wear ties. Men grumbled about chicken shit regulations, but Patton understood something. An army that's sloppy in garrison is sloppy in battle. Within weeks, 2nd Corps was winning. Patton led from the front, constantly visiting units, inspecting positions, chewing out officers who weren't aggressive enough. The Germans learned to respect American forces under Patton in a way they hadn't before. But Patton had a problem. He wasn't the only general in North Africa. British General Bernard Montgomery was there too, and Monty was getting all the glory. Patton despised Montgomery, thought he was cautious, vain, and worse, getting credit that should belong to Americans. The rivalry would define much of the war. Sicily, the race to Messina. July 1943. The Allies invaded Sicily. Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army on the east coast, aimed at Messina. Patton commanded the US 7th Army, assigned to protect Montgomery's flank, essentially a supporting role. Patton hated it. He was supposed to be Montgomery's flank guard. Unacceptable. So, Patton changed the plan. Without explicit permission from higher headquarters, he launched his army north and west, driving toward Palermo on Sicily's northwest coast. It was a spectacular dash, 100 miles in 4 days, that captured a major city and thousands of prisoners. It also left Montgomery's flank temporarily exposed, violating the operational plan. Eisenhower was furious but said nothing publicly. The operation had succeeded after all. And Patton wasn't done. He now had a shorter route to Messina than Montgomery. The race was on. Patton drove his men relentlessly. He took risks that terrified his staff, amphibious end runs behind German lines, night movements, constant pressure. Men died in these operations, some unnecessarily, but Patton was obsessed with one goal: beat Montgomery to Messina. On August 17, 1943, American forces entered Messina hours before the British. Patton had won his race. The photograph of him entering the city, swagger stick in hand, looking like he owned Sicily, became iconic. The newspapers loved him, the American public loved him. Patton was a star, and then, 3 days later, his career nearly ended. Part 4. The Slapping Incidents. When Heroes Fall, August 1943. The first slap, August 3rd, 1943. Patton visited an evacuation hospital near the front lines in Sicily. He was making his rounds, talking to wounded soldiers, when he came to a soldier sitting on a cot, visibly shaking, but with no apparent wounds. "What's wrong with you?" Patton asked. "I guess I can't take it," the soldier replied. Something snapped in Patton. He called the soldier a coward, then slapped him across the face with his glove. "You're a disgrace," he shouted. He grabbed the man by his collar, dragged him toward the exit. "I won't have cowards in my army." Medical staff intervened. Patton stormed out. He just assaulted a soldier diagnosed with psychoneurosis, what we'd now call PTSD, or combat fatigue. The second slap. 7 days later, August 10th, Patton visited another hospital. Again, he came upon a soldier with no visible wounds, diagnosed with anxiety. This time was worse. Patton not only slapped the soldier, but drew one of his ivory-handled revolvers and waved it in the man's face, threatening to shoot him right there. "I ought to shoot you myself, you goddamned whimpering coward!" Doctors and nurses were horrified. Word spread through the medical corps. Reports went up the chain of command. By late August, Eisenhower knew. Eisenhower's dilemma. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Patton was the Allies' best combat general. The Germans feared him more than any other commander. He just brilliantly conquered Sicily. The upcoming invasion of France would need aggressive commanders who could break through German defenses and exploit breakthroughs. Patton was uniquely qualified. But he'd also assaulted soldiers under his command. If word got out, there'd be hell to pay. Congress would demand his head. The public would be outraged. Eisenhower tried to contain it. He ordered Patton to apologize to the soldiers, to the medical staff, and to his entire army. Patton did so, though his apologies were stiff and clearly painful. He believed the soldiers were cowards and that he'd been right to discipline them. For 3 months, Eisenhower's cover-up held. Then journalist Drew Pearson broke the story in November. The American public exploded with rage. Congressmen demanded Patton's removal. Wives and mothers of soldiers wrote angry letters. How dare this general assault sick men? But something interesting happened. Among frontline soldiers, opinion was mixed. Many thought Patton was right. Combat exhaustion was malingering, and coddling it would break down discipline. Others were disgusted. The army was divided. Eisenhower's solution: Patton would not command forces in the D-Day invasion. He'd be sidelined, given a phantom army in England to fool German intelligence. The Allies' best fighter would sit out the most important battle. Patton was devastated. He'd spend D-Day in England, watching younger generals lead the invasion he should have commanded. The slapping incidents had cost him everything. Part 5. Redemption. The Third Army Rampage, 1944 to 1945. Breakout from Normandy, July 1944. 6 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces were still stuck in Normandy's hedgerow country, grinding forward at terrible cost. Then, Patton's Third Army became operational. On August 1st, 1944, Patton was unleashed. What followed was one of the most spectacular advances in military history. Third Army broke through German defenses and exploded across France. In 26 days, Patton's forces advanced 400 miles, liberated Paris, crossed the Seine, and pushed to the German border. German armies that had fought the Allies to a standstill in Normandy collapsed before Patton's onslaught. The key was Patton's philosophy: never stop. When his tanks ran low on fuel, he ordered them forward anyway. When higher headquarters told him to halt, he claimed radio problems and kept moving. When his flank was exposed, he attacked anyway, arguing that speed was the best protection. His staff worked around the clock. Patton himself drove to the front daily, often to forward positions where he could hear gunfire. He relieved commanders who were too slow. He promoted officers who showed aggression. He created a culture where standing still was more dangerous than attacking. The fuel crisis. September 1944. Patton's advance stalled not because of German resistance, but because he'd outrun his supply lines. Third Army needed 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. They were getting a fraction of that. Patton was furious. He blamed Montgomery, who was receiving priority for fuel for his own offensive in Northern Europe. Patton accused Eisenhower of favoritism toward the British. "Give me the fuel and I'll be in Berlin in 48 hours, he told his staff. It wasn't quite that simple, but Patton had a point. Third Army was stopped at the German border with minimal German forces in front of them. With fuel, they could have pushed into Germany in September 1944, possibly ending the war months earlier. Instead, the fuel went to Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, which failed spectacularly. Patton watched the disaster unfold and said simply, "I told you so." The Bastogne Relief. December 1944. The Germans launched their last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. American forces were caught off guard. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, running out of ammunition and facing annihilation. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of commanders. He asked who could relieve Bastogne. Montgomery said it would take weeks to mount an operation. Omar Bradley was uncertain. Patton spoke up. "I can have Third Army there in 48 hours. The room went silent. Bastogne was 100 miles away. Third Army was currently fighting in the opposite direction, disengaging 3 divisions, turning them 90 degrees, and moving them through winter conditions to attack the German flank. Military textbooks said it couldn't be done in less than a week. "When can you start?" Eisenhower asked. "I've already given the orders," Patton replied. He wasn't bluffing. Before the meeting, Patton had told his staff to prepare contingency plans for exactly this scenario. When Eisenhower authorized the operation, Third Army was already moving. In 48 hours, Patton's forces smashed into the German flank. In 6 days, they'd broken through to Bastogne. The 101st was saved. The German offensive was blunted. It was one of the most impressive operational maneuvers in American military history. Part 6. The Hammelburg Raid. When Pride Costs Lives. March 1945. The Personal Mission. March 26, 1945. Patton ordered a task force to raid a prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg, Germany, 50 miles behind enemy lines. The official reason? Rescue 900 American POWs before they could be executed or moved deeper into Germany. The real reason? Patton's son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, was being held at that camp. Patton sent Task Force Baum, 294 men, 16 tanks, 27 half-tracks. They were to penetrate 50 miles through German-held territory, raid the camp, and bring the prisoners back. It was suicide. The staff knew it. The task force commander knew it, but Patton insisted. The disaster. Task Force Baum fought their way to Hammelburg. They reached the camp. They freed the prisoners, including Waters, who was badly wounded when German guards opened fire during the liberation. But they couldn't get back. German forces closed in from all sides. The task force was cut off, surrounded, overwhelmed. The tanks ran out of fuel. The half-tracks were destroyed. Men scattered into the countryside. Of the 294 men sent on the mission, only 35 made it back to American lines. The rest were killed or captured. Task Force Baum was annihilated. And for what? The POWs weren't rescued. They were recaptured or remained in camps until American forces reached them weeks later through normal advances. Waters was liberated, but nearly died from his wounds. The operation accomplished nothing except to sacrifice American lives. The cover-up. Patton lied about the raid for weeks. He claimed he didn't know his son-in-law was at Hammelburg. He did. Intercepted German communications had told him exactly where Waters was. He claimed the operation was a legitimate military necessity. It wasn't. The camp was in no immediate danger and would be overrun by advancing American forces within weeks anyway. The press eventually uncovered the truth. Patton's reputation took another hit. He'd sent men to die for personal reasons, then lied about it. To his death, Patton never admitted the raid was a mistake. In his mind, aggressive action was always justified. The men who died at Hammelburg were casualties of war, no different than those who fell in any other battle. His critics saw it differently. Patton had sacrificed American lives for his family. It was the act of an ego-driven commander who put personal concerns above his men's lives. Part 7. The Wrong Enemy, April to December 1945. Victory and Disillusionment, May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Patton had led Third Army from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. He'd liberated more territory and captured more prisoners than any other Allied army. By every military measure, he was the most successful American field commander of the European theater. But Patton wasn't celebrating. He was looking east at the Soviet Union, and he was scared. We defeated the wrong enemy. Throughout May and June 1945, Patton became increasingly vocal about his views on the Soviet Union. In meetings with staff and visiting officials, he argued that the real threat to America wasn't Nazi Germany. It was Stalin's Russia. "We may have been fighting the wrong enemy all along," he told his staff. "But while we're here, we should go after the bastards now, while we've got the chance." His solution: ally with the defeated Germans, rearm the Wehrmacht and launch an immediate attack on Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. Start World War III before the Soviets could consolidate their control over Eastern Europe. It was madness. The American public wanted peace, not another war. The Soviets were America's ally. The idea of teaming up with Nazis, whom Americans had spent 4 years fighting, was politically impossible. But Patton didn't care about politics. He saw the Soviets as the next threat and wanted to deal with them while American forces were mobilized and in position. "We could beat them easily," he insisted. The occupation disaster. Patton's problems got worse when he was made military governor of Bavaria. He was supposed to implement denazification, removing Nazi party members from positions of authority. Patton thought it was stupid. "This Nazi thing," he said, "is just like a Democrat-Republican fight." He argued that the Nazi Party had been the only way to get ahead in Germany, and that former party members were needed to run the country. He started appointing former Nazis to administrative positions. When reporters questioned him, he defended the practice. When Eisenhower ordered him to stop, Patton dragged his feet. In September 1945, at a press conference, a reporter asked about his use of Nazi officials. Patton snapped, "The Nazi thing is just like a Democrat-Republican election fight." The comment exploded across American newspapers. Patton had just compared the Nazi Party, responsible for the Holocaust, the death camps, the murder of 6 million Jews, to American political parties. The backlash was immediate and devastating. The final relief. October 2nd, 1945. Eisenhower called Patton to his headquarters. The conversation was brief. Patton was relieved as military governor. He'd be reassigned to a paper command, essentially a retirement posting. Patton knew his career was over. At 59, he'd commanded his last army, fought his last battle. The warrior had nothing left to fight for. Part 8. The Death, December 1945. The Accident, December 9th, 1945. Patton was on a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany. His car, a 1938 Cadillac sedan, was driving along the highway when it collided with a US Army truck that had suddenly turned left across their path. The impact wasn't severe. Everyone in both vehicles walked away unharmed, except Patton. His head had struck the roof or a metal partition. He was paralyzed from the neck down. His neck was broken. He was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg. For 12 days, doctors tried everything. But Patton's condition worsened. On December 21st, 1945, he died of a pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure. He was buried in the American military cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of Third Army who had died under his command. Patton had requested to be buried with his men, and his wish was granted. The conspiracy theories. Almost immediately, questions arose about the accident. The circumstances were suspicious. The truck driver claimed he didn't see Patton's car, despite it being a clear day on a straight road. The truck driver was never identified and disappeared after giving his statement. No formal investigation was conducted. The accident happened just months after Patton had been publicly calling for war with the Soviet Union. Some historians believe Soviet intelligence assassinated Patton. The NKVD had motive. Patton was the most vocal anti-Soviet voice in the American military. They had means. Assassinations disguised as accidents were standard practice. The timing was perfect. Patton was isolated, vulnerable, and no longer protected by wartime security. Others believe it was simply an accident. Traffic accidents were common. Patton's injuries, while unusual, were consistent with the type of collision. The lack of investigation was due to his death being expected. Why investigate when the victim was dying? We'll never know for certain. Patton died under circumstances that remain controversial to this day. Conclusion. The warrior's legacy. George S. Patton Jr. was a walking contradiction. He was a military genius who believed in reincarnation, a highly educated man who spoke fluent French and studied classical history, yet cursed like a dock worker, a devout Christian who loved war, a man who cried when he visited wounded soldiers but slapped others he thought were cowards. His military record is undeniable. Third Army's advance across France remains one of the great campaigns in military history. The relief of Bastogne saved thousands of American lives. His aggressive tactics shortened the war in Europe, possibly by months, saving countless Allied lives. But his judgment was catastrophically flawed at times. The slapping incidents revealed a man who couldn't control his temper. The Hammelburg raid showed he'd sacrificed lives for personal reasons. His post-war behavior demonstrated he couldn't transition from warrior to peacemaker. The Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied general. When captured German officers were asked who they respected most, they said Patton. When asked who they feared most, they said Patton. He understood mobile warfare better than almost anyone else. His tactical genius was matched only by his operational audacity. American soldiers had a more complicated relationship with him. Some loved him. They knew that under Patton, they'd win, and winning meant survival. Others hated him. They thought he was a glory hound who'd spend their lives for newspaper headlines. Both were probably right. For American veterans today, Patton represents something important: the warrior ethos. He was flawed, difficult, often wrong about politics and people. But when it came to destroying the enemy and winning battles, he was unmatched. He was the guy you wanted leading your army when everything was on the line. His famous prayer, written before the Battle of the Bulge, captures who he was. Sir, this is Patton talking. The last 14 days have been straight hell. Rain, rain, more snow, and I'm beginning to wonder what's going on in your headquarters. Whose side are you on anyway? You know, sir, aside from the torrential rains, we've had one hell of a good break, and for that, I thank you. Asterisk. That was Patton. Arguing with God, thanking God, convinced God was on his side, all while preparing to send men into battle. He died believing he'd been a warrior in past lives and would be a warrior in future lives. Given his performance in this one, the next war might want to check if he's come back. Because if George S. Patton is reincarnated somewhere, you can be damn sure he's not going to be happy sitting at a desk. He'll be looking for a fight, and God help whoever gets in his way.